Welcome to the Compact for America's new video podcast series that will explore the looming crisis that our nation faces with out-of-control spending in Washington, D.C. that we believe results from the federal government's ability to simply print however much money it needs. This series will explore the underlying root causes, identify the impacts on everyday Americans, and provide a framework for one possible solution to rein in Congress, which is the Compact for a Balanced Budget. I am your host, 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗘𝗦𝗧𝗔𝗠𝗣𝗦, and in today's episode, we will introduce 4 members of the Compact team, provide a brief overview of the current situation in DC, and outline the goals and objectives of the Compact approach. As you will see, because we believe that Congress will be both unable and unwilling to solve the problem on its own, the state legislatures will have to take a more prominent role in restoring fiscal sanity at the federal level. This series is geared towards those members of the state legislatures who will need to step up and make the hard decisions, to the American people who will be impacted by these decisions, and to members of Congress who will have a role in encouraging the states to join the battle to prevent the looming fiscal disaster. If you like what you hear, please do us a favor. Check the like, share, and subscribe on our channel, and click on the notification bell so that you will be alerted when we post future segments. Let's start off by introducing to you members of the team and finding out more about their areas of expertise, what motivated them to join the Compact team, and what the hope of the Compact initiative can ultimately accomplish. Today, we have 3 members of our Council of Scholars with us. The first is Baker Spring. Baker is our Chief Capitol Hill liaison with Congress. He's a member of our Council of Scholars and has been involved with the Compact since day one. He has over more than 35 years of experience in numerous aspects of policymaking in Washington, D.C., specializing in national security, foreign policy, arms control, non-proliferation policy, missile defense, and defense budget issues. He has extensive experience in working with members of Congress at the staff level as a policy analyst on Capitol Hill and as a fellow with the U.S. Senate Committee on the Budget. He has specific expertise on the budget and the treaty ratification process, which will be helpful because we've got a compact that we need to ratify. He got his BA from Washington and Lee University and his master's degree from Georgetown University. Baker, we're so glad to have you today.
Thank you for having me.
In a minute, we'll introduce to you Robert Gmeiner and Sven Larson, but Baker, why don't we start out with you? Just give us a little bit of background on you. Where did you grow up? How far back does your family go with this great American country? Tell us a little bit about what your parents did, and do you have any siblings? Just give us an idea of Baker Spring.
Yeah, I was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, which I'm going to come back to as to one of the reasons I'm keenly focused on this particular issue. Educationally, I had always been interested in questions of foreign policy and national security, and specifically Congress's role in those matters. The main reason that I really got started in this is I saw that defense budgets were starting to come under pressure, even when I first arrived in Washington in the early 1980s, because of the explosive growth that was projected for non-defense spending in the federal budget. And it is clear that defense was by far and away the most important budgetary priority of the federal government when you look back into the 50s and 60s and even into the early 70s. That's no longer the case today. So I think that there's real serious national security implications with regard to the misguided fiscal policies that I'm seeing. The other reason I've mentioned Cleveland is that Cleveland is a city that under exactly these kinds of circumstances at the local level led to fiscal crisis and brought Cleveland to default. That was during the time when Dennis Kucinich, later a member of Congress, among what today we would call the Democratic Socialists, was running the city. So that even though I did not live in the city of Cleveland itself, I was from outside, the effects were dramatic. And what I could say is that if it can happen at the local level, it can happen at the state level, it can happen at what I would call the national level, the sovereign areas of the government where you think that there wouldn't be that problem. But we know from foreign experience, and I think one of our future presenters here today, Sven Larson, can talk about that in regard to Sweden. But we've seen Greece, we've seen Argentina. It is entirely possible that fiscal crisis can happen to national governments, not just state and local governments. So that what I am focused on with regard to the team is I've always been tracking Congress more than any other institution throughout my career, as a Senate staffer, as a defense national security analyst at a Capitol Hill-based think tank, and as a fellow at the Senate Budget Committee, as you mentioned. So that this is a very, very serious high-stakes game. And as Chip, as you mentioned, this is not an issue that there's any logical incentive for Congress to ultimately do the right thing. And so that I think there's going to have to be outside pressure brought to Congress to help right this matter. And that can come from the states, it can come from the population at large. And these are not going to be easy steps. They're clear as to what we need to do, in my mind, but that does not make them easy to do. And so that we've got a long road to hoe with regard to getting the United States government off the fiscal path that it's on, which leads to fiscal crisis and, in my judgment, ultimately default.
So let's go back a little bit. How did your family end up in Ohio?
Basically, that's a complicated story. My father's side of my family, as best that we can track it, they came to the United States very early on from England, United Kingdom, and was originally in upstate New York, at least as far back as we can track. My father's father, the grandfather on my father's side, came to Cleveland pretty much in the late 1800s, and was a lawyer by trade. And that's what my dad did. He was a lawyer as well in Cleveland. My dad was on the corporate side. And so that with regard to my mother, as best we can track it, she had relatives that came from Missouri, I think North Carolina for a time. Her family moved to Cleveland, I think, in like the early to mid 1800s. And she was what we would call a stay-at-home mom for me and my siblings. I had three siblings. One of them unfortunately passed away a number of years ago. And I have two other siblings. One is living in Arizona, and the older one, my older brother, is now, I would call it semi-retired. He was a lawyer in New York. He followed in my dad's footsteps.
Did you ever want to be a lawyer? I ask you that because my dad, as you know, was a lawyer too.
Yes.
I did not follow that path.
I certainly was interested in it to some degree, but I was more interested in terms of politics and the legislative process. But then those are so tightly knit that, I could have done it. But I got my degree from Georgetown is in national security studies.
Well, thanks. We also have Dr. Sven Larson, who is an international political economist who provided key input into the development of the balanced budget amendment that is the overriding policy objective of the Compact Initiative. Sven was originally from Sweden, and he went to graduate school in Denmark and moved to America in 2002. After making a living as a college professor, he went into work in public policy, which is what he's been doing ever since 2005. His research is focused on macroeconomics, the welfare state, and the relationship between political ideologies and economic policy. His interest in this subject was awoken by the severe austerity crisis in Sweden in the early 1990s, when his native country became one of the first to enter an economic state he has defined as industrial poverty. With more than 20 years of scholarly research and experience from the practice of economic policy, Sven has come to the conclusion that a bloated welfare state is a chokehold on the free market capitalist economy. It has already brought Europe down into economic stagnation, is doing the same with Canada, and has begun impacting America as well. He believes that reforming the welfare state is an existential mission for our country and for Western civilization as a whole. Okay, Sven, now tell us how you really think.
That's kind of a dramatic introduction. Thank you. The welfare state is sort of a term, an umbrella term we use for entitlement programs and for spending programs that provide in-kind and cash benefits based on certain terms of who is eligible. When I say I think we need to reform the welfare state, the reason for that is, I don't mean abolish the welfare state. I want to point that out. I think this is a pressing bipartisan issue where both sides of the aisle need to get together and rein in and reform the spending programs within the welfare state so that they become fiscally sustainable. And what got me started on this, what got me into this line of research was, as Chip mentioned, the experience, very painful experience from the Swedish fiscal crisis in the early 1990s, which followed on the heels of a crisis in Denmark a few years earlier. And both these countries, which are obviously neighbors and very much alike in many ways, both these countries suffered badly, where people who had been promised benefits by government lost those benefits without the opportunity to replace or go out and find another way to provide for themselves. So, for example, just to take a very small example, the child benefit checks that we now have here in America, when they were cut, there were families, low to middle income families, who depended critically on that check to be able to feed and clothe their kids. They had just adjusted their budgets to that. When that was cut in the wake of this austerity, there was no way for them to excuse me, to make up for that lost income by going out to make more, because taxes were going up. The economy was in the tank, which was obviously the reason for the austerity. So the point is that the programs were not set up to align with what the economy could afford to pay for. And this is the structural problem that I think we have in the welfare state, and that is, in a very brief nutshell, why I got into this, because I saw this. This was not just a Swedish or Danish phenomenon. It's happened in Britain. It's happened about 10, 12 years ago. It happened in Europe. Greece, obviously, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Ireland. We saw it in France. We saw it in the Netherlands at that time. Every welfare state practically has gone through this. So I see the same structural imbalance in the U.S. economy, and I got involved with the compact and took a great interest in it, because I believe that we have actually developed the solution for at least the beginning of this reform process to prevent an austerity crisis in America, which I think would be devastating to our economy. We've never seen anything like, Baker mentioned Argentina, like they have in countries in Latin America, in South America, or in Europe, or for that matter, a few other countries. So that is in a nutshell where I come from. As Chip mentioned, I went to grad school in Denmark. So I lived in Denmark for a total of 6 years, first going to grad school and then teaching economics. So I got to live under two of the largest welfare states in Europe. It is easy to think that America is insulated from these mechanisms, the fiscal and macroeconomic mechanics behind an austerity crisis. We are not. We are a big economy. We have a very big currency that gives us more padding, if you will. But it doesn't mean that those mechanisms aren't at work here. They are.
Were you born in Sweden?
Yes, I was born in Sweden. I come from, my parents were first generation to go to college. I come from a background of very poor farmers. We've been able to track my family back about 500 years in northern Sweden and northern Finland. Part of my family lived in northeast Finland when it was part of Russia. They were forced by the Russians to either become slaves to the Tsar, taken back to Russia, or to flee. So they walked from northeast Finland all the way across the tundra, if you will, into Sweden, where they resettled. That part of my family speaks a particular version of Finnish called 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗘𝗦𝗧𝗔𝗠𝗣𝗦, which I knew as a kid, but I've forgotten it now. And it is an interesting background to have when you come to America, because a lot of people don't know much about it. But I have distant relatives who came here in the 1800s. One of them actually sailed by boat from Tromsø in Norway to, I believe it was Nova Scotia, in 1851 during the winter. And that's a journey. It's hard to realize how hard that was for them and for other migrants at that time.
And do you have siblings?
I have a brother and a sister. A brother who's been working in law enforcement, a sister who is she's an archivist, visual archives is what she works with. They're still back in Sweden. I'm the only one who's over here, my son and I. And then I have, I just came to love America when I came over here. I fell in love with this country, and I decided to stay.
You're a U.S. citizen now?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I gave up my Swedish citizenship. I think you should only have citizenship in one country. I know there are other people who disagree with that. My wife actually is dual citizen, Swedish and American.
Well, we really appreciate the perspective you bring, and the international perspective, and the fact that you've been places that have gone through this before. So you can bring some real life situations to the table, and those make for good discussions.
Thank you. And I want to add one thing also, that I think the Compact has assembled a formidable team to work with these issues. I have over the years been impressed with the quality of the work that we put out. Not to brag, but quite frankly, we have something to offer when it comes to substance that I believe is not only necessary but highly valuable, and that's why I've stuck with the Compact ever since its beginning. It's my reason for that is that I think we don't compromise when it comes to quality analysis and putting out meaningful information.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think all of us share that same commitment. Is get down into the details and don't just talk about something, but come up with real solutions. And even if that may take, like it did with our BBA amendment, to over 2.5 years, just to develop the amendment itself, not to even talk about the compact delivery vehicle. Well, we've got another member of our economic team online with us today, our newest member of our Council of Scholars, Mr. Robert Gmeiner, who's recently relocated, I guess, to North Carolina. And so that's going to make for some interesting discussion, because we're currently actively trying to get North Carolina to join the compact for a balanced budget currently. Robert attended school at Wake Forest University, where he got his Bachelor of Arts in Economics and Russian. So he got his master's degree from Florida State University in economics, and he got his doctorate in economics also from Florida State University. He's written some really interesting articles in his short amount of time in the industry. One I really wanted to hear more about was the term limits and state budgets. Now, are those interrelated, or are they two separate issues?
Well, generally, they've been thought of as two separate issues, but I wrote this in graduate school, and we actually did find a link that between the two ideas, term limits and state budgets, that a number of states, a minority, but a substantial minority, have term limits on members of the state legislature. Usually, how many terms you're allowed to serve in one house, or a combined limit for total time in the legislature in either house. And what it turns out is that the states that have those term limits do tend to have slower growth in spending at the state level. Now, states generally have the balanced budget requirements. There are, unlike the federal government, they have ways of circumventing that with off-budget debt, usually for investment, ostensibly for investment. But we tend to see lower growth rate of spending at the state government level when there's a term limit in the legislature. Interesting.
Well, tell us a little bit about you. Where did you grow up? Tell us a little bit about your family. How far do y'all go back in American history? Let's get to know Robert a little bit more.
Sure. Well, I grew up near Winston-Salem, North Carolina. My dad was on the faculty, still is, at the medical school at Wake Forest. So I did my undergraduate degree there, staying pretty close to home. And shortly before I entered college, we had the housing boom that was, I'm going to say, the straw that broke the camel's back for getting us into that crisis that began in 2008. That, I think, was brewing for a while. But I was an avid reader of newspapers, just kind of gobbled it all up. And something just didn't ring true, because I remember reading stories about, interest-only mortgages, which never struck me as a good idea. Rapid growth in the housing stock, many more people buying homes. And kept hearing, talk about this is great for the economy, but I've personally been very averse to debt in my own life. I try to avoid it. I don't like the fact that I pay a mortgage right now, but there's not a very easy way around that for buying a house. But I'm averse to debt, consumer debt, all kinds of debt in general, and try to avoid it and minimize it. And when I saw that this growth was all based on debt, something never quite rang true, and I really wanted to understand that a little more. So I decided to major in economics as an undergraduate, and then right as I'm starting, lo and behold, things boil over into that financial crisis that I don't think we've ever fully recovered from. I think we put some Band-Aids on it and made it look like it's recovered, but I think the structural flaws are still there. And I couldn't really ever put economics down. I just ate it up so much that after a short while of working as a mortgage underwriter, after undergraduate studies, I went to graduate school at Florida State, where I got my master's and doctoral degrees. And I've written on a kind of eclectic variety of of topics since then. But there are generally some links to debt type issues in a lot of my work, not all of it. Sometimes I'm looking at issues that I think are exacerbated by inordinate debt, and also the enabling practices of the Federal Reserve. Keeping interest rates low, of course, makes government borrowing easier, makes debt issuance in general easier. It also makes it harder to get a return on any savings at the bank, which propels savings of people who want returns into other assets. You've kind of termed that over financialization at times, which we have a very complicated financial system in this country. And I've written some work that hoping will get published in a respectable venue soon about the damage that over financialization can cause for the real economy, production of goods and services.
What about siblings? Do you have brothers or sisters?
I have two brothers. I'm the oldest of three. One of my brothers is also a PhD economist. He and I, very brilliant. He and I view things a little bit differently. I'm, of course, very much concerned about debt and a number of other issues as well concerning international trade. Get along really well, bounce ideas off each other, but there again, don't always agree. So I'm fond of repeating the old joke that if you ask 5 economists, you'll get 5 different answers, 6 if one went to Harvard, and luckily neither one of us went to Harvard. So our opinions.
Well, we're really glad to have you on board the team. How did you find out about the compact?
Choice Society meetings in the spring of 2021. I was presenting a paper down there at the same time that Baker was also presenting a paper giving an overview of the compact and the debt default clock, something I'd never seen before, wasn't familiar with, but took a liking to it and asked a few questions at the end of the presentation, wanting to learn more, and have been kind of interested ever since, realizing that this was not just a topic for academic interest, but a real pressing issue that I'd been aware of for quite some time.
Well, I'm glad you reached out to Baker, because I think there's a lot that we can do together collectively going down the road, especially with you now being in North Carolina. We're so close to getting legislation passed in the Senate there. Hoping that can happen this session, and be looking forward to hearing more about it as we have future segments. I'm sure we'll have one segment specifically on North Carolina. Well, I guess you might want to know a little bit about me then. So rather than me talk about it, I'll have Baker give you my technical stuff, and then I can tell you about our family background.
Chip DeMoss is the leader of this team. He's the chief executive officer of the Compact for America Educational Foundation, which is the institution that really manages the day-to-day activities in terms of advancing the compact and the balanced budget debt controlling amendment that is the central part of it. He has over 30 years of financial experience in financial operations. He's undertaken advisory and investment roles with regard to real estate and energy sectors in particular. He began his career as a major accounting firm, and he audited financial statements of public and private corporations. So he's quite an expert with regard to the ins and outs of everyday accounting. Since then, he's held management positions in several prominent family offices and private corporations that invest heavily in these two sectors, real estate and energy. In addition to being a CPA, he's a registered investment banker and a chartered global management accountant. He received his undergraduate degree from Texas A&M University and his master's degree of science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And let me say is that one of the leading roles that Chip plays in terms of the foundation is that the foundation has been chosen by the interstate government agency called the Compact for a Balanced Budget Commission as the compact administrator, so that we are interacting with an institution that is essentially an extension of the state governments that have already joined the compact and looking ahead by those that may join in the future.
Well, great. I get really inspired by all this when I look back at our family tree and follow it back and realize that some of our ancestors came over to Massachusetts within a few years after the Mayflower had originally landed there. You work your way up through the different family trees, and then you find patriots that fought in the American Revolution alongside George Washington, were encamped at Valley Forge with him. I just get chills when I start reading about my ancestors that were there in that awful environment. We got family trees that spread into the Texas Revolution, specifically the Davy Crockett tree. We're related to Davy Crockett. And then more recently, the family tree spreads into the Nimitz name, which is Admiral Chester Nimitz, who led the nation in the war in the Pacific during World War II. I get incredibly inspired when I read about all those folks and realize what they went through to form this nation and to keep this nation a viable nation. My grandfather on my mom's side was a building contractor. Maybe that's where I get my love for real estate. He built schools and office buildings in San Antonio, Texas. He comes from the Nimitz side. The grandfather on my father's side, interestingly enough, was a banker with the Federal Reserve in Houston and Dallas. I don't think he had anything to do with the current situation at the Federal Reserve, but it's really interesting to know that connection is there. My dad, mom and dad, after they got married, they moved to Houston, I was born in Virginia when dad was in the military, but that was only for a year. Then they moved back to Houston. Dad went to work for a law firm here locally. It eventually became a major international law firm, and he was like the fifth attorney to join on board. He was there for almost 30 years until in early 1991, he was appointed as a federal appellate judge to the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. I've got one sister who's a travel agent for another international law firm. And fortunately, the lawyers are starting to travel again. There was a real if on whether she would continue her job, because for the past year, there was zero travel on the part of the international law firms. But now they're starting to break out, which is good. I'm a private pilot. I like to ride my bike. I guess if you asked, I'm naturally inquisitive. I like to understand how things work. I like to take them apart and see if I can put them back together again. And it was really back in about 2012 when I was just doing my investment banking, real estate, oil and gas work that my dad, who was a senior judge by that time on the Fifth Circuit, came to me and said, "What are you going to do about this crisis that's going to face your kids and your grandkids?" And I was like kind of oblivious to all that. I was like, "What do you mean, Dad?" And he sat me down and said, "Look, my time is growing short. I've got a limited amount of time while I'm still on the bench. I'd like to be involved in an effort that we could put together a team to try to address the runaway spending and the runaway debt for our federal government," because he said, unless we get that under control, I think bad things are going to happen for this country. And I said, "Well, let me go look into that, Dad." I spent about 6 months reviewing it and got back to him and said, "Dad, I don't know why I was so oblivious to all this, but you're absolutely right. We've got to come up with a team we can't do this on our own. We got to develop a team to try to see if there's a way to address this. And so that was the early formation of the Compact for America Educational Foundation that ultimately ended up having as one of its key primary initiatives, the Compact for a Balanced Budget. We were fortunate to hook up with Nick Dronius, the lead constitutional attorney at Goldwater Institute back then, who happened to be thinking the same thing at the exact same time. And when Nick and Dad hit it off, it was just incredible to listen to those two constitutional lawyers get on the phone and talk through ways that we might be able to address this. So that's how I got involved. I would, one of the funnest things I ever did was put the team together, bring in experts from all across the board. We're really a virtual organization. We don't really have any employees. Everybody is on their own at the Compact doing their own thing, but they're associated with the Compact for America Educational Foundation, and on an as-needed basis, if we need papers written, briefs made, testimony, we've got people located all across the country. Robert, you being in North Carolina, Sven, you didn't say this, but you're in Wyoming. Baker, you're in Virginia. I'm in Texas, and we've got people spread out all over the country that are experts in law, constitutional law, economics, politics, dealing with state legislatures, dealing with members of Congress. So pulling that team together has just been, the relationships that we've all developed in this has just been amazing. So I thank you all, and you'll get to meet more of the team members as we go on in future segments. Any other, y'all have any questions of other team members on backgrounds or anything?
I don't have any major questions, but I was realizing everybody else talked about the family stock and roots on this country, except me. But I was going to say it was pleasant to hear about Baker's roots in Cleveland, Ohio, because as I look on both my mother's side and father's side, my mother's side goes back all the way to the Revolution, both up in the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, and New England, as well as in North Carolina, after having been gone for a few generations and finally back here. On my dad's side, all German and Austrian immigrants. As you can see, the name Gmeiner, one of the toughest and rarest names in this country, but very common in Austria. And they've been in Cleveland, Ohio, every single line on that side for decades, except me. Never have lived there.
Let me say is that one thing I should expand on with regard to the grandfather on my mother's side is that it's really important to understand what a powerhouse in terms of the early stages of the Industrial Revolution Cleveland was, with steel mills, oil refineries. My grandfather was the one of the two partners which founded a very high-end engineering firm that did these kinds of major projects. And part of the story with Cleveland, apart from its financial mismanagement as a local government, is that how difficult a time it had adjusting to what ultimately we call today the post-industrial era. And it really is an important lesson in and of itself, because success as a society at the cultural level, at the economic level, at the military level, at the political level is not guaranteed. Decline can happen. And the only thing that prevents it from happening is a commitment to doing the right things that we know need to be done in order to avoid the kinds of disasters that can befall any society.
Can I add a point there? I think Baker just made a very, very important point regarding the foundation for why we are doing this work in the Compact. There is a sense of invincibility among I hate to use this term, but let me use it anyway. Political leaders in America that we saw in Europe back before the crisis, a bit over a decade ago. There was an arrogance in Europe at that time. It was less than a decade after the formation of the formal formation of the currency union. There was this idea that nothing could happen that would, excuse me, nothing would happen that could upset the economic progress and the growth. That the currency that they had just created was invincible. And it turned out to be not the case at all. On the contrary, it turned out to be an institution that was not at all prepared to deal with this type of crisis. And to Baker's point, which I think is exactly on target, I believe that there is the same sense of naivete, almost arrogance regarding the dire fiscal situation that America is in. And we need to understand that we are not above the mechanisms that ultimately lead to a crisis. When a country creates prosperity, sets in motion the growth, the ingenuity, the innovations that build growth. When workers commit to producing and reproducing that prosperity, that is not something that just happens, and it's not something that always happens automatically. On the contrary, this is something that you have to protect and care for, if you will. Be very mindful of not disturbing, which is what the mechanics that cause a fiscal crisis do exactly that. They disrupt the mechanisms, the forces of prosperity. So to understand, for one of the goals that at least I see with the compact is that we can get precisely this point across to our political leadership, both at the federal level and in the states.
Well, let me talk a little bit about it. That's a good segue into our next section, which is the summary of the Compact Initiative. I know we've mentioned the Compact for America. That is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that, like Baker had said, has been designated as the Compact Administrator for the Compact for a Balanced Budget. So that's a separate initiative inside the foundation. And what is the Compact for a Balanced Budget? Well, there's three basic components to the Compact for a Balanced Budget. And the primary payload is what we call it, which is the legislative objective ultimately, is the Balanced Budget Amendment that's actually contained in the Compact. And we'll give you a download link to the legislative package in the description here to this video. But the Balanced Budget Amendment itself is what took us 2.5 years to develop. And we, amazingly enough, we got it down a really state-of-the-art amendment that we got down to one page. Keep in mind, this is an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. It can't be a 40-page amendment. No amendments to the Constitution are that long in nature. But in a future segment, we're going to go over the Balanced Budget Amendment itself in quite detail. And you can look forward to finding out how the Balanced Budget Amendment establishes for the first time a constitutional debt limit. It puts the state legislatures in control of future increases in that debt limit. If that's going to happen, it gives the president the tools necessary to protect the integrity of the Balanced Budget Amendment. And it has some real benefits in terms of tax strategies and in promoting certain ways to encourage reductions in spending first rather than increasing in increases in taxes. That'll be a whole segment unto itself. What we call the balanced budget amendment itself is contained in the compact for a balanced budget. Now, keep in mind, a compact is just a fancy term for a binding contract among member states. And currently we have 5 states that have joined the compact. We got Georgia, Alaska, North Dakota, Mississippi, and Arizona. And we've made some great progress, as we said, in the state of North Carolina. So what the compact does, it sets in motion the whole process by which the state legislatures, for the first time, could propose the balanced budget amendment as an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution provides that state legislatures can propose amendments. It's unfortunate that that's never happened before. Of the 27 amendments we have, every one of them has been proposed by Congress, none by the states. So if the states are going to do this the first time, they've got to have a process by which to follow, and that's what the compact is. And we'll have another segment where we'll get into the details on how the compact itself works and all the protections that are contained therein to make sure that the states only propose this specific amendment. And then finally, the Constitution provides that there is even though the states are proposing this amendment, there is still a role for Congress, and Congress basically has to determine that the requisite number of states have joined in the application to propose the amendment. And once they do that, then they formally start the amendment process by calling a convention of the states to actually propose the amendments. That's the role of Congress. So that's the third critical component of our approach, is getting Congress on board early on so that they can be part of this process and actually encourage the states to get the job done through the compact process. So that'll be part of our future segments that we'll have. And those will be fun ones to talk about.
If I can just jump in and say, when I first met with Baker at the Public Choice Society and saw just how this whole thing was structured, how detailed, concise, but specific that amendment was, and the whole structure of the compact approach, that's really what pulled me over the edge with interest, because I thought this was an important issue for quite some time. And there had been a number of proposals to do things about it, but every one of them seemed deficient, as in not having enough, or somehow flawed. So the subsequent videos about this will make it clear that it really addresses just about all of those concerns. When I was an undergraduate at Wake Forest, Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson came to speak, and this was after that commission was over and it kind of fizzled out and nothing really came of it. But I was lucky enough to be on a question panel for them in front of the whole audience, and I'd asked, is there merit to a balanced budget amendment approach? And their answer was no. Alan Simpson had even said it wasn't just kicking a can down the road, it was kicking a 55-gallon drum down the road. And come to find out in the years since, there's not really any other way to do it. And just the lack of the political will in Washington, I think, has made it pretty important to have this state-driven approach that really plugs all the holes where things could go wrong.
Can I jump in there? That's a really important point that Robert makes about the detail, the attention to detail in this amendment. As Chip mentioned, I was part of creating it. The first time I was notified about this, it was by Nick Granius and another economist, Byron Schlomark, who was with us at that time. He was working with Nick at the Goldwater Institute, and I believe that's how he was involved in the initial process. They approached me and asked if I wanted to be part of this process. They presented the amendment to me, and I read it, and I was impressed with the details. But I I saw one flaw in the first draft, and it's that, to make a very long story short, there was mechanism in it that could allow Congress to blackmail the states to raise the debt limit, or vice versa. There was a quid pro quo situation there that I said, I pointed to that and said, you have got to fix this if you want to have a clear and solid enforcement mechanism that is going to actually have teeth. And at that time, Nick, I said at that time, I don't think I can be part of this because of this. If you can find a way to fix that, I'll be happy to work with you. And Nick came back to me a while later and said, listen, here's the reform that we put in to address your concern. He had actually spent quite a bit of time addressing precisely that mechanism. I was very impressed with that, and that was really the only major concern I had initially. And so we fixed that, and the attention to detail has been the same all over in every aspect of the BBA that we have. And I think that's one of our strengths, that we continue to pay that attention to detail.
And I'll just make one quick observation too. Is one of the things that's very important historically with regard to this initiative is it really understands how Congress got off on the wrong path here. It goes back to the law which still governs the basic budget process of the United States. It was enacted in 1974, the Congressional Budget Act. And ultimately, because Congress has shown no willingness to move away from the flaws in that particular statutory instrument, that we are drawn to a constitutional amendment approach in order to get away from that mistake that Congress made in that time.
Well, Baker, I'm going to bring up this slide here that is who our target audience is for this series of dialogues, and if you could talk to that a little bit.
Sure. Let me go through each of them one by one. The state legislators, and with the second one, in hand in glove with their governors and treasurers, are the people that are going to actually come together to create the compact. And so that, and they do that by the state legislatures passing substantively identical laws that are signed into law by the governors, so that every state that joins the compact is completely on board with a singular purpose. And so those two elements are actually the people that will create the instrument for both the ultimate adoption of the amendment and its ratification, ultimate ratification. Congress plays what is really a ministerial role here. The Constitution, Article 5, requires that the Congress call the convention. The Constitution uses the word shall in that regard, that once the states have sufficient number to actually have an amendment convention, it is Congress's ministerial duty to call it. We have proposed a particular approach by use of what's called a congressional concurrent resolution to make sure that that is done in the appropriate fashion, that it is recognized as a ministerial duty. The members of the executive branch and their staffs are really observers in this context until the amendment is ratified. And then the president, in particular with the support of other elements of the executive branch, has a very important role in making sure that the constitutionally established debt ceiling is not breached. One of the problems with the 1974 Act is that it virtually outlawed what had been used extensively prior to 1974 by presidents to exercise impoundment control over spending. And so this constitutional amendment will restore what I think that by tradition was an appropriate responsibility of the president, the individual that represents all of the people of the United States and not special localities and special interests. And it's going to be through that impoundment mechanism if necessary. We hope it never comes to that. And I think the incentives are that it will not, but it is there just in case. But ultimately, every American has to come to this issue. The reason that Congress can't resolve this problem isn't because they don't recognize the problem. It is that until the American people and other institutions outside the Congress and, of course, the President of the United States as well, are hearing from everyday Americans who will be severely, there's unanimity that if there's fiscal crisis, it's going to be catastrophic to the financial and economic position of the United States. And so that the problem is that the institutional circumstances are such that Congress will be, in my judgment, virtually unable to act by this until it's too late. They'll try and remedy the problem like Dr. Larson alluded to in Sweden, but when you're doing it at that point in time, you're talking about really, really severe austerity, and the level of pain will be extraordinary from that perspective.
Yeah, so those are our target audiences. I'm going to ask Sven if he would just talk about upcoming topics of discussions that we're going to have.
Yeah, we have, of course, a lot to talk about. We have both. We need to both talk about the amendment itself, the vehicle, the balanced budget amendment, or rather the process by which we get it passed, and the payload, which is the BBA itself. That, of course, we're going to talk a lot about. We're going to go through what they are, how they work, what is unique about them. There have been, and Baker knows this to greater detail than I do, but I think 14 different statutory attempts in Congress to bring about a balanced budget. There are several different constitutional amendments proposed. We are going to talk about how ours is different in terms of its ability to actually enforce a balanced budget. But there are more pressing topics as well. One of the things we need to talk about is the expiration of the federal debt limit that happened on July 31st. And its consequences for the federal government, for the economy subsequently, in case this drags on, because the expiration of the debt limit is one aspect of one reason, if you will, why we need a balanced budget amendment, because Congress cannot. Congress is unable to self-enforce a balanced budget. That is what the whole problem with the debt limit has shown us. Another very important issue in relation to this is the congressional budgeting process, which Baker at some point will explain to us in great detail. We also need to talk about the relationship between the federal and state governments and why the states have an interest of their own in working with the compact and getting this balanced budget amendment passed, because they do have a very strong interest on their own in how the federal government manages its finances. One of the more compelling topics we're going to talk about is the debt clock, which is an instrument for measuring how close we are to that fiscal crisis. A really interesting. If I say tool, it doesn't give it justice. It's an entire model, if you will, for measuring. how close we are to a real fiscal crisis. So I look forward to that discussion. We have a lot of other topics. I'm not going to go through all of them now, of course, but I wanted to mention one, and that is the relationship between the debt we have now, the deficits that Congress keep running on the one hand, and the rising inflation crisis that we have. There's a mechanism between those two. They are related. It has to do with the printing of money. And in other words, in a very small nutshell, the debt crisis is now beginning to take a direct toll on the purchasing power of American families. And so we need to talk about that, and we need to contrast our approach against one of its striking alternatives, if you will, which is modern monetary theory, which says you don't need to balance the budget. You can just print as much money as you want. If I'm going to be a bit crude, it's a little more complicated than that. But so we're going to talk about that as well in the context of why our amendment makes such a huge difference and why it is so necessary. We have a lot of other topics as well, but I think that will do for now as an overview.
Chip, maybe we can bring this to a close here today by leaving with the people that pick up on this initial webcast, which is that there's a slogan they can have here, which is that I can't set my credit limit, and the federal government shouldn't be allowed to set its own. And that's the fundamental problem. And for itself, what as a borrower, what its credit limit is, and that's wrong. And so you can't do it in your household. The people who are the slogan that I would like to leave with our viewers, because that really gets to the crux to the problem.
Great. You were kind of dropping out there, but I think we got most of that. Let's wrap up here. Let me tell the viewers, in our description of the video, we're going to have links where you can actually download these documents we were just discussing, the actual compact agreement, the text of the balanced budget amendment, the congressional resolution. They're all in one document called the legislative package. We'll have the links where you can visit our website and sign up for emails, and where you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And also, we want to encourage, if you like what you hear, please get involved. And there's ways you can help the initiative. First of all, click on the subscribe button. We want to get to 1,000 subscribers as quickly as possible. And once you do that, also click on the notification bell so you can be alerted to when the new segments are posted to the channel. And when we get this down to an art and science and we're all comfortable appearing in front of the camera, which we don't do for a living, we'll start thinking about maybe doing some live podcasts and taking questions live. Tell your colleagues and friends about this video podcast series. Get them involved, and if you can, please donate to the cause. The link will be found in the description as well. And we use PayPal, and they only charge 3% of the transaction. And you can use either your PayPal account or any debit or credit card that you so desire. So that's it for today as far as meeting the team, getting an overview of the initiative. We are so excited about the upcoming segments. We'll probably try to do those once a week. If something comes up that's really pressing, we might do one on an ad hoc basis, but our goal is to try to do one a week for the next 3 or 4 months and see where this video series heads. We're looking forward to it. Any final comments from any of you guys? We'll stay on. We'll end the broadcast, but you guys stay on. We'll do our proper goodbyes after we stop the broadcast. And thanks for everything, and look forward to seeing all you viewers in the future.